Afternoon, folks. We're going to wait another minute or so before we get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is the Assembly Quality Municipal Services and Ethics and Elections Committee. We are noticed today, Wednesday, February 28th, from 12 noon to 1 p.m. here at City Hall, room 155. Let's go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions.
Zach Johnson.
Karen Bronga.
Daniel Voland.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera, and on the phone we have Mr. Myers.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. And then Mr. Littlefield.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Fantastic. All right, so we have a few items on our agenda today. Hopefully we'll be able to get through all of these in the time allotted. So let's just get to it. First item on our agenda is a committee referral of AO 2025-18, a ballot proposition amending the Home Rule Charter to update the charter text with corrections for grammar and legal rulings. Just as a reminder to folks, this was an ordinance brought forward by Vice Chair Zolotel, and it was referred to this committee with the idea that this committee would bring forward a recommendation back to the full assembly, and that is when the ordinance would come back to the assembly. So it's not set for a specific date, so we don't have to rush today to come to a recommendation. We can have a discussion and perhaps at a future meeting formalize a recommendation. So with that, I figured as chair of the committee, I would come with the proposal to start the conversation and then see where the conversation goes from there. So I know aside from this particular ordinance, 2025-18, I know that I know that there are a variety of lists out there of charter changes that have been collected over the years. I know I have my own list of charter changes that I've collected over my tenure beginning in 2017 to now. I'm fairly certain that Dean has a list of charter changes that he would love to have included. I bet you other members and maybe the administration also has a list of charter changes that they'd like to make, plus what's in this ordinance. There is a precedence to do this in a methodical way, which is a charter review commission. So the last time, and I think really the only time that we've had a charter review commission since the charter was adopted by the voters was in 1990. There was a charter review commission created by the assembly, and on that particular commission were such dignitaries as Joe Josephson, Cliff Grow, not the Cliff that we know, but as I understand it, his father, Frank Reed Sr., Bill Sheffield, Joshua Wright, and others. The process for that particular commission, the commission was created by the assembly. Suggestions were sent to that commission for review, and it actually was a pretty lengthy list of suggestions that were compiled by the clerks and sent to that commission as the starting point of their discussion. Commissioners added to that list some other items to consider as well, and they had a whole variety of meetings, over 24 meetings between February and July of, I don't know if it was 1990 or 1991, think it was 1990, between February and July of 1990 to come up with recommendations. They allocated at the time $50,000 budget for that commission for an attorney and secretary so that that commission could do its work. And they sent their recommendations to the assembly and the mayor. The branches decided which changes to send to the voters and which to not send to the voters. So in the end, the decision is in the legislative branch to decide say yes or no to any recommendations. And then it was up to the voters to say yes or no to the recommendations of the Charter Review Commission. So in total, it was about a 6-month process once the commission was created for that work to happen, and then for the assembly to eventually send stuff to the voters for consideration. Some pros and cons of this particular methodology. It does, and these are from my perspective, it does take sort of the recommendations and a lot of that legwork out of the, I think what some would call sort of the political sphere of the assembly and the mayor. It is a time-limited commission, and it doesn't put the workload on our plate to go through all of that. Cons would, if it mirrored anything like the 1990 commission, it would need significant staff support. And it does put the assembly on the sidelines until the end of the process, which some might see that as a pro and not a con. Depends on your point of view. So I think that was all that I had to bring to the table in terms of looking at precedent and possibly replicating that for the future. Or we could, as a body, say, we don't want to go through all of that. Let's just say, let's approve 2025-18 for the next municipal election. That, of course, forgoes all of the other possible changes that folks have been thinking about over the years. So laying that as a foundation, and happy to hear thoughts from the members. Anyone want to weigh in? As I stated before, and I don't want anyone to feel pressure to weigh in. We don't have to come up with a committee recommendation to send back to the full assembly today. That can be at a future meeting after folks have had a chance to mull things over, have discussions, and we could come back to this at the March meeting if we're prepared at that point to have a formal recommendation and further discussion. But this is just an introductory conversation. Yeah, go ahead, Member Johnson.
I'll just say quickly, I think I mostly remember it was in 2025-18, but I don't have a copy in front of me, so I don't know how much to dig into that right now. I'll say for my part, I certainly see value in going the commission route. I think for the reasons you already outlined, I think it helps to depoliticize the process, and I think it's probably something at the end of the day the voters would have to contemplate and might appreciate. I guess the question about whether or not to actually undertake that is there enough meat there to sort of justify the work it would take to stand it up and take it on. And we have 2025-18. If all they're going to do is take that and sort of spend 6 months sort of making minor tweaks around the edges, maybe it's not worth it. But for people who've been around longer and maybe have a deeper perspective, is there enough work there to is there more we would want to do if we had that resource, I guess, is maybe the question I'm starting from.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll respond to that because I do have a particular opinion on that. But first, Member Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. One question of clarification, and I have other thoughts. Does it require getting elected to a charter commission? Because I think that's how it happened in the 70s, but I don't know that that's required, but that's helpful to know if it's a baseline. Because I know same with constitutional convention, it triggers electing delegates. That's helpful to know if that's a required thing or not.
Yeah, thanks. So in this point, there's a distinction between the charter commission, which helped to form the charter, which eventually went to the voters and was approved, and a charter review commission. So the charter commission, yes, you do have to get elected to that, but We already did that, right? Charter Review Commission is just a simple appointment process, just like any other board and commission.
Okay, that's super helpful because yeah, I would agree. So I guess in general, I'm looking at it as a timing thing, like in terms of what, and kind of to Member Johnson's point about the cost benefit of that. And then just generally, I think in my mind, looking really big picture about where the city's at, I think my interest would be to put the most effort into talking about our long-term fiscal situation. There's a lot of different pieces to that. And I know we're talking about individual pieces of it, but I think there's just a step back and really have that conversation. And that does intersect with the charter. So one example is if we do something different than bed tax, depending on what it is, that could be reopening the charter and changing where that money goes, just as one example. And so I'm interested in that conversation, but I don't know that certainly it's outside the scope of this particular ordinance. And also I worry that it would become kind of the mechanics of the charter and not that subject matter. So so to me, it's the cost benefit of, do we put our limited time and capacity and eventually asking the public to make some decisions into that specific thing. And then similarly with this ordinance, I think it's one of these things where it's like it's really helpful to clean things up and make our charter better. And I think this is a good opportunity. And also, again, the cost benefit of having to bring that to the public. And then the more that we put in there, the more one of those things makes the whole thing fail. And I'll just use one example briefly. The thing right now that says we need 60% to approve any kind of retail sales tax, but then the conflict that it has with the AK Constitution, if it's something that changes the charter, which is required for dedicated funding, which is mostly what these propositions have been over time, right? Or at least recently. So anyway, so that kind of thing is where there's only really so many options because the Supreme Court already spoke, or whatever court ruled on that issue. But to voters, it's still going to look like the binary choice of whether we want that or not, right? So I guess I see the same risk for both of those. I think there is benefit to having that conversation to build up to the point that we can explain what these things are. But I am worried about the cost benefit, especially is that the best use of our capacity. And then one more comment I'll just say is on this particular thing, I still think it could move forward, but I don't want to put it on the ballot too early. Like I wouldn't want to vote on it next month or something because who knows what else will happen. So I guess I'm also thinking of the push pull of wanting to get it right and get it done so that it's out there for voters, but then knowing, there's a lot can happen, and we have, up to 4 up to 6 new members starting. So there's that part of it. Anyway, so that's kind of my thought is like, I'm not inclined to push forward with a commission like that right now. But again, it's because of kind of the other things on my mind that I think we should focus attention on. But I get why at some point we should do this. Thanks.
Thanks. All right. Not seeing anyone else. Just to provide some final commentary before we move on. To sort of the question of, is there enough meat for a potential commission to chew on? I would argue that there is enough meat in the category of sort of cleanup issues in the charter and consistency issues in the charter. I think some of the larger questions, which Member Brawley brings up, perhaps a charter review commission isn't the best forum for some of those much broader, I think more political high stakes discussions. And I will say one of the positives of a charter review commission, and it's actually something that we saw with the 1990 charter review commission, is that that commission also discussed a variety of what they called at the time contentious topics. And in the end, the assembly is the decision maker on whether to make that political calculus of whether we want to send those contentious topics to the voters or not. So there is that, I think, shield in the end that's still there. Okay, so then what I'm gonna
on that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an interesting thing, the concept of politically contentious topics. Just the way the moment is kind of developing across the country. I feel like anything reasonable things are suddenly politically contentious. And so it definitely raises some extra caution in where I'm at when we talk about the overall conversation about charter conventions and those kind of things. Just it raises caution.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess just to reemphasize, certainly this process that I have described is not a charter convention. I just don't want that language to be put out there. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and if there's nothing else, we'll end this conversation. I'll put this back on the agenda for March with some potential pathways and formulated recommendations in writing. And hopefully also in writing, you'll have a list of that meat, quote unquote, that folks were looking for. So we can March have a more substantive discussion around some specific recommendations. So moving on, review of the hockey community survey. I will go ahead and turn this over to the North Anchorage members.
Thanks, everybody. We had some outreach by users of the hockey facilities that raised the question of maybe we need to understand perspectives of the users of the hockey facilities that are under agreements that the assembly approved, the previous administration put forward for 5 years. And I would draw your attention to the handout that you have before you and the summary there. This was an anonymous survey where nobody was identified, but they were provided the opportunity to self-identify. This document is a survey that is completely anonymous. And so if you look at the Likert scale there, you can see that, I guess not quite a Likert scale, but at the scale that generally speaking, there is low to mid satisfaction over the operation of the facilities. If you look at somewhat dissatisfied, mostly dissatisfied, and completely dissatisfied, you get 4 respondents. 2 of the 4 in the somewhat dissatisfied. You have 1 respondent who came back neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and then 3 in the category of somewhat or mostly, but none in the category of completely. And so, just the general sense then you could take away from this is that there is, again, there is satisfaction, but it's a low level of satisfaction leaning towards things could be better and things need to be better. So that's kind of the entree point to the conversation. If all of the responses were added here in the document, and they run along the lines of a few things. First question was, describe your experiences that come to mind when describing the score you gave above. So that's kind of general open. And then the next one is what's working well. The next one is what could be improved. And I think that was it. And so, oh no, and then is there anything else you'd like to share? Just the general open question. The concerns that we heard really come in 3 flavors. One being the facilities are deteriorated. And that's one I think isn't really on the operator. That is in a lot of ways on the municipality, and it's a general condition across a number of our domains. And so there is definitely some work that can be brought to bear on the question of those facilities in order to improve the offerings, but there's also mixed information on that. Some people are pretty satisfied. Their comments were along the lines of, the bathrooms need to work. It's a bit cold. The facilities don't look great. The Zamboni is broken. And the Zamboni is a gray area between the two, us and the operator. Locker room doors falling off, bathrooms not working, et cetera, things of that nature. And then there were concerns raised about customer service, about ice time. And the ice time conversation was split like pretty generally between it's not good, it's not fair, it's expensive, and it's working fine. It's better than it was under SMG. It's working. And so there's definitely some area for improvement there. And that's where the administration has really taken to reviewing the agreements and compliance to the agreements. And Bill, we didn't do any kind of preview of this. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add to that in the context of the work that you're doing.
I'll take the invitation just to say that it's correct, that we've reviewed the operating agreements that apply to the Boki, the Sullivan, and to the Dempsey, and are making sure that we are getting all of the things that we are entitled to, and that's an ongoing conversation.
And so if you were asked to kind of summarize the kind of position as opposed to just say you're in a process, is there anything you're ready to put out there? It's okay if the answer is not yet.
No, I mean, I can candidly tell the assembly that we realized that we had not received all of the reporting that we were entitled to. And so we've made that request. I don't believe we have received it yet. But I also don't think that I'm ready to sound any kind of alarms. I think that process is still playing out.
So I guess the takeaway, if you heard, is that it's ongoing. There's been some lack of information, maybe part of us being responsible, part on them. You know, if you don't ask the right questions, even though you would expect the terms are met. So the gist of this, I think, is that there are still some concerns among the users. There are some concerns among the administration. There are some improvements. There are some areas of improvement that really need to happen. And that's the gist, I think. I don't know if you want to add anything. So,
Thanks.
Karen, question.
Yeah, I have a queue. So we'll start with Member Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, and I'm sort of tangential to this whole issue, but I remember why we're here. I just wanted to add another, I guess, complication or another factor into this that I know is outside the scope of this survey. We've been getting a few emails related to ASD's budget, of course, and sports, but where it connects, I think, is at least in the emails that I've seen, I think they went to all members, was basically people feeling like the fees are high, which I see reflected in here, and then basically asking if, you know, the Muni can help subsidize ASD for their ice time, which again, I know is tangential to this, but I think is part of that. So I just want to put that out there. And I've said, you know, the two biggest challenges are our tax cap, you know, fitting that in there in addition to what we're already funding, not because no one wants to do it. And then also just the reality that, you know, that the State Department of Education has said or kind of signaled multiple times that they may enforce the idea that any money that we're giving to the school districts, instructional or otherwise, is counted as our local maximum. So that's not where we're at right now, but that's the risk of putting more money into ASD if that comes to pass. So anyway, all that to say, I just wanted to say for this conversation, that's also part of where people are interested, I think. So I want to mention that. But I don't know what the right answer is. And I'm not saying that the right answer is that we subsidize that, but it's another big user group of these, at least some of these facilities. So
I would add that, you know, I did read some of those emails that some hockey supporters want the municipality to pay the school district to run ice for them. And they used the police example. We picked up the bill for policing in the schools because the previous administration had forced those costs onto the schools when there are police. And I think one of the factors to consider in the conversation is that picking up the cost of police is generally applicable to all of the schools, to all of the students, versus picking up the expense for a very narrow bandwidth of students that would be subsidized to the benefit of a handful. Those are the elements that we have to really contemplate when we think about the utilization of potential subsidy dollars. And so it's both, will this harm us in the context of our maximum local contribution, and where can we make investments that generally apply and help instead of narrowly apply to a small set of people. So, but that is an ongoing conversation. And the conversation about ice time, it is quite interesting. $400 for an hour of ice at a municipal range. It seems like a lot. That's here $385. But it costs money to operate those things. It's tricky.
Thanks. So next I have myself in the queue. So a couple questions, or actually one's just a reminder for folks that in the 2025 audit plan, we did add a contract compliance audit that should encapsulate these facilities. So that is something that we will see at some point, hopefully later this year, the results of that particular audit. I guess question to the North Anchorage members, are there particular pieces or results from the survey which you'd like this committee to chew on, or is this now in the hands of the administration as you see it?
Yeah, so I think still kind of working through the thinking. You know, there were some advocates who came forward with concerns. We said, let's do the survey. We'll make it anonymous. Tell us everything. Tell your peers to tell us everything. And it's clear that the people who came to us didn't reply because the matters of consideration that they brought up, which seemed very real and concrete and specific and not great, didn't make it into the survey. And so it was anonymous. So there is going to be some more work to go back towards the various user groups and kind of try to elide or kind of elucidate some of these items that were spoken about that aren't quite reflected here. They're implied here. So I think there's a bit more work in this conversation between us and legislative services and the work to get to the question. But at the same time, I think for the most part, the administration is handling these matters because they are looking deeply into the contract. And so I think the purpose of having the committee report was just so you know what we were doing. You saw the outcome of the conversation. This was a very spicy assembly matter when it came before us originally, so that you are kept in the loop as we go forward. So there's no action at this time other than awareness.
Okay, thank you. Member Braga?
Thank you. I actually, when I look at this, I'm like, wow, that's a decent result. I mean, I don't see anything alarming in the survey results. And if you asked pool users their satisfaction of the pools, you would probably get a similar result. So if the people who are most concerned didn't do the survey, that's probably why. And that's not to say that I don't think we should fix it. I think it just brings the idea that we have so much deferred maintenance throughout the city to my mind. The other thing is bringing up the user fees. I've been contacted by swim and hockey, and bringing up the thought that if those sports are cut because we can't afford ice time or pool time, then, you know, we actually are losing out on user fees, which were scheduled to be 554,250 next year. And so I put in a budget amendment, which I don't know if it will go anywhere, that we just have the user fees. We're still bringing in some income for that and keeping those sports afloat and utilizing buildings that we've invested quite a bit into. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. All right, any other discussion on this? Not seeing any.
You know, I just
Yeah,
one
go ahead.
clarification. I would push back on the idea that any of these sports would be canceled because of the user fees of the facilities. The fundamental problem that the school district is facing relating to the loss of sports that the district is having to wrestle with, and I think that we'll be seeing that budget soon, is they haven't seen an increase and they're having to make very difficult choices about where they're spending money. And so just in deference to the school district's hard decisions, I would say it might help some of these organizations if someone else came in and paid the expenses, but it's certainly not going to be the $385 of ice time that is the difference. It's the can't afford a coach, can't afford travel, can't afford all of those things. And that, in my opinion, you know, we pay every dime that we're lawfully allowed to. And so I just want us to be really clear to the public that it's not because of our fees, it's because of the funding challenges in Juneau, in my opinion.
Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next topic, an elections updates. Mr. Northrop.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, I would say that we are in a good position currently. I guess a couple of bullet points that I wanted to bring to the attention of this committee is that last week we had a successful election worker training, which involved our signature verification team. We had a hazardous materials training and also a de-escalation training. And just want to give kudos to Ryan Lane for his de-escalation training. The workers were very engaged and really enjoyed his knowledge and his demeanor during that training. Another thing to note is that Monday, February 24th, we sent out 1,385 ballot packages to overseas and military voters. And on March 11th, we will be sending another 204,493 ballot packages to Anchorage voters. We have received 332 temporary address applications, and that is we're still receiving a bunch of those for the folks who will not be in state for this election. Our logic and accuracy testing is tomorrow at 10:30 till 1 or whenever we finish. And that is just to make sure our scanning, adjudication, and tabulation equipment are working as expected. And that's an annual thing or before every election that we have. For anyone listening, the last day to register to vote is Sunday, March 2nd. And that is also to update your voter registration if you need to. And then a couple last items is our drop boxes are being deployed next week. And then starting March 10th, we'll have our various election teams, such as our Dropbox team starting. Our drop boxes will be open on the 11th when ballots are mailed out. And that is, again, the same week that ballots should be arriving in voters' mailboxes. And then I think I might have misspoke about LAT. I think I said 10:30. It's actually at 10. So 10 to 1 or until finished. But then the last thing I want to note for this meeting is that our vote centers are set to open on March 25th for people who want to vote in person or have other needs that they would like to talk to people in person about. Yes, so vote centers are located here at City Hall, at Lusac Library, and the Eagle River Town Center.
Great. Just one quick question. Is the election worker team fully staffed?
Yes, we are fully staffed. I think we're going to have to pull someone from clerk's office for one position, but otherwise we're good to go.
Fantastic. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Do we have a Dropbox in Girdwood?
Yes, so there's a drop box out in Girdwood, there's one out in Eagle River, and then the 16 remaining are spread throughout the municipality.
I know there's long been conversation about, because there's nothing out that way in terms of a vote center. And I know we can't staff one for 2 weeks. It wouldn't make any sense, especially with the low number of potential votes coming in. Has there been any consideration of, like a limited hours, 1 day, 2 days, staff up a point out there where folks could come in, you have the computer set up and they can do whatever they need to do?
So I haven't heard of any conversations prior to taking over this role. I don't think there's been any indication in the past election either. I would say that the Dropbox itself is, people enjoy it out there. And I can say that the Dropboxes are one of the most used ways to return ballots to us. ABCs are the third. So it's Dropbox, mail return, ABCs, and then electronic voting.
Right. And the way I see the voting centers is more of a problem solving location, right? It's if there's a problem, then you go there and it can get fixed. Anyhow, I'm not going to push that. I know the clerk might throw rocks at me, but it's challenging. It's far, it's limited value, but it's certainly something that has been a conversation.
Thanks. Member Brawley?
Thanks. Yeah, I think, so I've kind of started talking to folks just in general, because I think, this is one of those off years, right, where it's, we already kind of expect or historically have seen lower turnout. I am really worried that people will just forget about this election. And I know it ramps up, especially in March, right? And I know you guys do as much as you can as far as communications. I guess the ask is, and maybe more to legislative services, just to flag, because I know they also do a lot of really great communications. Make sure to push it out to all 12 of us, the assembly members, and just to say, like, everybody, when you're meeting with community councils, make sure you're saying XYZ on the elections. Cause I think, I know we all know how to communicate with our councils, but I think I just know when you're in the moment and you're trying to write down, like, what do I need to tell everybody and what 3 things out of 500 could I say? I think the March cycle is the most important one, and we're about to all go to those meetings. So just to say, like, please pointedly tell us to go do that. Cause we just, again, want to amplify, just especially if people are out of town, they might forget to do the out of town option or, whatever it is. So I'm just already thinking, like, I want to make sure everybody votes, and just concerned about that. So how can I be helpful? Thanks.
Wonderful. All right, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for that update. All right, last but certainly not least, we have the review of Title VII rewrite ordinance. So just as a preface before I turn it over to Mr. Falsey, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We did just earlier today get these two documents, the ordinance and the AM. So I don't expect everyone to have read these and be prepared for a fully detailed discussion today. So I don't expect us to get into the nitty gritty. We'll likely have this back on the agenda in the future. But for now, we'll have a good foundational discussion. Turn it to Mr. Folsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. After hockey and elections, I'm excited to bring you the moment you've been waiting for, the Title VII rewrite ordinance. Perhaps the most quintessential good government ordinance, highly important, has a huge effect on the whole municipal machine, but could also be accused of being very boring and unlikely to result in any kind of press coverage.
I'm just gonna say, Bill, I want everyone to put a pin in that because when we get to the end of this conversation, I have some foreshadowing.
Oh, ominous foreshadowing. As the chair said, this is a special preview. This one is coming to you on the March 4th Assembly agenda, maybe by means of the addendum. But we wanted to get it to you as early as we had it, in part because it is chunky. It's 29 pages long and it is a consequential thing. We wanted to give everyone an opportunity to dig into it. Partly, that is also reflective of the process by which this has been born, which is the administration had a number of interests where it was motivated to pick up Title VII. And we previewed with the chair and others that you may have some interest as well. And it turns out you did. And so we have really developed this in a kind of ongoing collaboration with the chair, the vice chair, and the chair of this committee, which is not to say that they've put their names on it as co-sponsors yet, but we've been trying to, as we pick up Title VII, the purchasing code, make one rewrite that works for everybody. And so as the chair said, I don't want to go into fine detail now, but I do want to give you kind of the 50,000 foot orientation as to what this is all about. Why do we have a Title VII at all? Because our charter says that the assembly has to provide for competitive goods and services. It's not just a good idea, it's also legally required. And so in 1979, we adopted our purchasing code. And a good chunk of our Title VII hasn't really changed a whole lot since 1979. And so there were a lot of things that we needed to do on the administration side just to make it more user-friendly, to update it so that it reflected our current practices, and because we had some business practices which we had sort of shoehorned into some of the provisions of Title VII, which were in a little bit of tension. So for instance, assembly members have all hired assembly aides, and we did that largely through sole source procurements, which by the way, are not even really expressly mentioned in Title VII. Sole source doesn't appear by name in Title VII. And we thought that that was probably better addressed by saying there's a specific rule for assembly aides. So let's just do the quick orientation to the memorandum, and we'll set this up for future conversations. As we say in the memorandum, there are about 8 big categories of things that are happening here. The first is we are required, the administration is required to bring to the assembly information when you have to approve contracts above a certain amount. And I diagnosed that there was a little bit of a what target are we aiming for that was causing some tension. So we have tried on page 5 of this ordinance to stay in much greater detail. This is the kind of stuff the administration has to bring to the assembly so that you are empowered to make a well-informed decision and the public can see what we're asking you to do. I think that actually serves our interest real well too, because all of this is the public's business. All of this is public. We will bring to you what you guys need. And hopefully that has been seen as a matter of practice in the last few months. I think when we first arrived, there was even an open question of whether you got recommendations of awards attached to the assembly memos. And we said, no, send that too. So those have been coming as a matter of course. So that's the first step. Page 5 is listing out the kinds of things that we think we're supposed to bring to you in the future. Second, assembly approval thresholds. This is one piece of Title VII that has changed a lot over time, and the assembly members will probably recall that it was ratcheted down pretty significantly in the last few years. And here, there is an essential trade-off between oversight and prior approval and efficiency, and we have proposed to sort of go back to where it was. So you'll see that we have shown where the thresholds were set back in the day, where they would be if they had been just adjusted for inflation. Some of those we're proposing to go back to just to actually adjust them for inflation. Some of them we're saying, let's just go back to the way it was. And that has been a part of our ongoing conversation. We all in that topic, I think that does attend to one of the interests that we have, which is we also know we have an important software update that we have to get through next year, the S4 HANA update, which uniquely will affect purchasing because the S4 HANA update will make the current purchasing module we have stop working. So we'll have to do a new purchasing module. And there are some concerns about how we staff that. So one of the reasons for this proposed changes, not just so that maintenance and operations can get construction projects on the street more quickly and we can hit seasons, but also so that purchasing can field that ball when it comes to them next year. Next, on page 4 of this memo, rules applicable to legal and single source procurements. On page 21, we have added to the list of kind of unique flavors of procurements. And one of them has been to introduce this new concept of a single source procurement. There are times where the municipality has, for instance, purchased DocuSign, and then it needs additional DocuSign licenses or Adobe license, software licenses, or vice versa, where we have said, as a matter of administrative convenience and overall cost savings, we're going to put all of our graders on a John Deere or a Caterpillar platform so that we can have parts that work for everything and we're all having one kind of training. That, again, has been somewhat shoehorned into the sole source procurement framework, but really identifying it by name is probably better. Meanwhile, there are already provisions about the way legal procurements work, but they've been sort of glommed on to the end of a long section as we pick them up and move them into a new place. Fourth, post-award assembly reporting. It was actually surprising to me as I was diving into this to know that some of the stuff that we do now isn't written down in the law or in the code right now. So you get the sole source report every meeting, but that's as a result of like a 1984 resolution that says we sure would like it if you would send us a sole source report. So we thought, why don't we put that in the code, and put a lot of other things too. So we have tried to say, just as we want to be clear about what target we're aiming for before you approve things, after things are approved or things that didn't require approval, this is what we're going to bring to you. So hopefully you have a chance to dig into that. Our competitive competition thresholds are the fifth thing that's on page 5 of this memo, and that's addressed on page 22 of the ordinance. Just as there are thresholds about what we have to bring to you for prior approval before we issue it, there are also thresholds about what we have to compete at all. And so those have not really been adjusted for inflation, and we're suggesting some inflation adjustments there. 6 is grants. We have very few provisions about grants in Title VII now. We have a giant chunk of leftover Anchorage municipal regulations. And folks who've been keeping track of this for a while will know that there's not really an independent utility or a reason why the Anchorage Code of Municipal Regulations exists. So we have been over time picking up all the regulations, deleting them, and moving them into code. The regulations at play here are the request for grant proposals process, which is an optional process for grants that works a bit like RFPs. And we've tried to pick it up, modernize it, put it into code, and get rid of the regulations. Number 7 is a new provision about elections. This is one that we didn't originate, but which we came to a place I think is pretty comfortable. We did want to talk about what would happen in an instance where the Assembly's election officer is trying to deliver an on-time, timely, good election, but for some reason there is some impasse that arises between purchasing department and the elections officer, and we proposed to break that tie, as the Assembly has said in the powers and duties of municipal clerk section in Title 28, that the clerk will ultimately be in charge. We just need to sort of have a way of managing that resolution. And so that is a piece of the code that is now proposed on page 24 of the ordinance. And then finally, just general cleanup and readability. There's a lot of new section headers. We use the terms that we're actually familiar with, ITB, RFP, sole source procurements, et cetera. That's now found in the code. And then various other items that more conform to modern practices are imported there. So it's a lot to go through, but we wanted to get it to you now and let you know it's coming. And then hopefully we'll be able to address it in a future work session before it arrives to the actual Assembly agenda for action.
Great, thank you. Member Brawley?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll have to digest this more. I know some of the problems that this is trying to fix. But I guess I do have a couple questions. And I also appreciate the trade-off between, like you said, the transparency and efficiency, right? Because I think on the one end, we don't approve anything and then it's not transparent. On the other end, we all spend, hours and hours processing stacks of documents. So I get that. I don't know what the right answer is. I guess one feedback before I get to questions is thinking about adjusting for inflation. I wonder if there's, because I agree that should happen. I wonder if there's a way to say every 5 years it gets ramped up or something like that where the number doesn't change. Because I could see where, eventually it's, 46,793 or some odd amount. So just thinking about that would be my feedback. And just in general, I think, besides the permitting process at development services, the other thing we hear a lot about, and I've had lived experience dealing with, I think other members have, is my grant is stuck in XYZ process and it's been there for 6 months. And then it's weird for us to just insert ourselves, but it feels like that's the only way a lot of these log jams got solved the last few years. So I'm looking forward to fixing it generally. My questions are, I guess, well, one with grants, like how, can you maybe characterize a little more how this treats grants separately? Because I know that's been its own conversation too with alcohol tax. And then do we hold these not organizations to the exact same standards as a professional services contractor? That's one question. And then the other one is I was flipping through looking at online procurement. So we passed a code change to, one, allow for online procurement, especially for grants, but two, that people should not pay user fees to access that application system. So I didn't see that second part in here, but I know that this isn't a full rewrite of the code. So I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost. That's my other question.
Thank you for the question. I'll take them in reverse order. There is nothing in this ordinance that says folks don't need to pay to use the online system, but folks don't need to pay to use the online system, and that's been by means of the budget. And I think that actually may be showing up in first quarter budget revisions, because as we surfaced that in the first go round of the proposed budget, we realized that purchasing hadn't fully incorporated that. I don't suppose that we would necessarily be opposed to that, but either way, we're aligned that we don't want to make a fee for submitting bids through Bid Express. For the first question, how are grants addressed here? Really, grants are addressed in only two ways. And Brian, who I'm looking at in the audience, will throw something at me if I got this wrong. There is an optional request for grants process, which has always existed in the regulations, and it just kind of mirrors the RFP, and it's not a requirement to use it. Mostly the health department has used it. It's just something like RFPs for grants. And so we picked that up and put it here. And then otherwise, there's assembly approval thresholds for grants, and they are a lot lower than the approvals for contracts. And I think that is somewhat by design, because the historic view has been, we're sort of as a matter of beneficence saying, here's some money, go deliver us an arts project or do something nice for the community. I do think that in recent years, the line between grants and contracts has blurred. And we have tried to address that a bit by defining grant, changing the definition of grant here to say where the municipality is really exercising some retained ability to oversee quality or the particular character of the thing that the grant money is being given for. That's starting to feel a lot more like a contract and should be treated like a contract. And so, for instance, a lot of our really sizable sheltering and food provision procurements have been grants to operators at 56th Avenue Shelter, for instance. And I think that going forward, we might want to just call those contracts and make them contracts. As to your animating concern about grants getting stuck, that's very much true, and we're working that project less through code and ordinance and more through administrative wiring. So actually just this morning, the whole health department grant team was sitting down with the controller's office and OMB and putting the thing on the board and just trying to figure out how that machine can work much more smoothly.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick follow-up. So the reason why we, because I think Mr. Rowland and Ms. Bronga were co-sponsors on that, we had to argue with the prior purchasing director, who I know is not here now, but about that idea of charging user fees. And we pointed out that at the state, there's a system for both contracts and grants that does not require that. And it's also, I will use the bad word of equity, it's an equity consideration for especially small organizations accessing those. So I think I would still encourage keeping that in code, even though it's not your intent. But just kind of, again, worrying about access to funding, because there's been a whole lot of conversation about who accesses muni funding, what that looks like. And the answer is not getting rid of this process. No one's asking for that, but it's really, how do we just care for that kind of consideration? And I saw some language about small business. I'll read this closer, but I just think it's good to maybe codify that because we already did that. So thanks.
Thank you. Member Constant?
I don't have too much on the detail because I've been deeply involved with this for a long time. I would just note that the vice chair and myself, probably the chair of this committee, are sponsors. And so my little physical note, the only thing I saw that was like, wait, we're not there. But it's not a big deal. And a lot of time and effort went into this. In some ways, if you remember last Rules Committee, we went over that list of legislative projects and the increase of legislative projects over the last couple of years. Much of it is likely due to the change in the levels of reporting for certain procurements at a certain level. When we went down to the 150 line, I think it pushed up the actual work, and we heard that from purchasing that that was going to happen, and it did happen, and it helped and it served its purpose. The question really this raises when going back to that standard level is, are we through that? And it's a fair question, and I think the answer is, of course, yes, or I wouldn't have at least asked to put my name on it and been working on this for 6 months or a year. But that is the gist. Is a lot of this is restoration, a lot of it is cleanup, and it's definitely worth your time to review. And we'll be, I don't know if we'll take it up March 18th or not, depending on the sense of the body. We can, if you have a chance to read this, or it can come back here for.
Thanks. I have myself next in the queue, and yeah, that's actually good segue to the question I was going to ask. Does the administration have a preferred public hearing date?
6 months ago. No, we're not on a critical timeline. I mean, I think
Okay.
we are excited about pushing this over the goal line, but no, I can't say that it has to happen.
Yeah, I guess it'll depend on how comfortable members are. I think getting to what you stated earlier, this is, you use the word, not me, sort of boring, but also very critical, right? It's our view, or the Assembly's view, into millions of dollars of spending each meeting. And getting to what Member Constant stated, there was a lot of discussion around thresholds and grants and how we treat those in the many months of meetings that happened prior to today. So I feel fairly comfortable with the product, but I also understand that this is the first time that most of you have seen the product. Okay, so sure.
I would like folks to know that this has been worked on for a few years now. And one of the primary movers in this effort was a member who won't be here after April 21st. And
Yep.
so I would say there is a time bound there just for the ability to conclude a project that was a multi-year effort.
Yes, yeah, Vice Chair Zalatil has put in a lot of effort into this. So I don't know, and I'll leave this up to leadership, whether you, just considering the timelines, whether you want this to be a work session or bring this back to the committee. It may behoove us to just have a work session on this rather than bring it back here, because it'll probably just be the same group anyway. Okay, so then I saw Member Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. 2 questions. I see and I understand the rationale for the new category single source. In terms of thresholds, is that the same as sole source when it would require assembly approval? And I feel like looking here on page 4, it seems to imply that, but I see we reference the paragraph with single source explicitly, or with sole source explicitly, but not the subsection with single source, although it seems to kind of fall into the catch-all. But I just wanted to make sure that that's addressed and that I'm reading it right.
Yes, the intent was definitely for those to be both at the $50,000 level, and I believe that it's all decoded in the section on page 4, 71540, which has the somewhat inscrutable list of all the different approval thresholds, but we will double check that.
Yeah, it's, and I could read it more carefully. It looks like at the end it says, well, 50,000 is sort of for everything, but also specifically for sole source. So I don't know, it's sort of an interesting way to construct that, but I'm sure smarter people have looked at it than I. And then the other question I want to ask is about the ITV RFP threshold. I know it's 500,000. I understand why it went down to 150, and now we're talking about going back to 500. Is there a rationale for why we're picking 500? You know, that sort of is more, you know, fulsome than just, well, that's where it used to be, so let's go back to that number again.
Through
There's
the
something
chair
specific
to
about
Member
500 that
Johnson.
just makes it feel like to say that's the right place for it to be.
And you'll see that that's probably the longest section of narrative in the memorandum. And I think the candid answer is, it was set at 150 for reasons I think are sort of known by the assembly, but it was previously set at 500,000 in 2007. So if you adjusted that for inflation, we'd be at $750,000. And then we talked about how some of the other thresholds in our peer jurisdictions are set. And I mean, I think all things being equal, the administration would probably be like, hey, $750,000 would be great. I think this is where we reach the essential sort of policy trade-off between how much prior approval and control do you want to have, and this has been kind of the ongoing dialogue. So I think we landed at a place where there was an overlapping consensus where everybody could get on board with going back to the way it was.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead and then
And
Member
to
Brawley.
put a finer point on that, this is where there's a difference between the interests, right? The interest of the efficiency, the interest of reducing workload, the interest of getting things quickly across the table, is more of an administrative interest, even though it's ours at some points. But the interest of seeing inside and having the details and having the ability to provide our fiduciary responsibility. And so there was a proposal to go a bit higher, and there was some pushback on that in our conversations. And so it became a pretty easy default setting to go back to where we were, because it doesn't push the boundary beyond where we've been. And the conversation about inflation over time, you know, is one that you can apply to each of these tables, as you'll see in the memorandum. And if we went that way, some of these thresholds would actually be substantially higher. But I don't think that that necessarily serves the interest of the body.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. So just looking at time, I think we'll do Member Brawley, and then I'll go to audience participation.
Yeah, I just want to put one other brief thought on the table. So there's maybe something to think about, and I know the team has already been thinking about this, but just for everybody else, there's what do we need to approve, and then what do we need to put in the record? And I'll say, you know, because there's on the consent agenda, there's all the stuff that this memo says we normally just approve them, right? And so in my mind, it isn't so much that I'm going to go and vote no on something. It's more kind of knowing what it is, right? Or how it fits in, or sometimes, you know, finding errors, things like that, right? So the question, I think, is really like, what should we put on the record, and then what does need actual approval? Because we have been doing that I think it's now required in code, the sole source, like those other memos that show up in the 10Fs, the information. So it's out there. It's not something that we are going and saying yes or no to, but it's in the public record, not just for us, but for the public. And so I think that's another kind of consideration. Not, again, because I want to put a bunch of paperwork in there, but that's another tool we can use that is separate from actual approval, which I think is a higher threshold and does have more risk, right? More uncertainty. So that's another thought. Thanks.
Thanks, Member Constant.
So when we started this conversation, Mr. Falsey had talked about long, slow, steady, boring projects, and this is important work. And the next one on the table that we've picked up is a review of Section 330 of the code, which is personnel rules. And so it's going to be a broad searching and deep dive into our HR codes, which will probably top this one for its absolute paint peeling excitement and but value to the municipality. So that's on the dashboard.
And through the chair to Member Constant, I will say some people might think it's boring, not me. And the fine people of purchasing, this is scintillating. I did want to say as a final comment before this all wraps up and we go back to audience participation, that I wanted to thank the purchasing department, all of the affected agencies that we solicited feedback from in the Muni, the members of the assembly that helped with this. And I also really would have been remiss if I didn't mention that Claire Ross did a really great amount of assistance on this and did some real deep dives on some of the early drafts. So thanks to her.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. All right. Are there any members of the public who would like to participate? I don't think there are any members of the public in the room. Are there any on the phone? Okay. With that, thanks everyone. We are adjourned.